Well, we are now on track to get to our main topic, which is violence in Doctor Who. This is a topic that I think has a lot that can be discussed about it. It is a controversy that has surrounded the show pretty much throughout its 60 years. And Rob, I'm going to start the topic by asking you a question. I haven't told you what this question is, but I want your gut reaction to this question.
Yeah, I can see on the run sheet, opening question for Rob, but there is no question there, so I haven't had to prepare for it.
Yeah, so gut reaction, Rob.
Okay.
Is Doctor Who a violent show?
No.
Interesting.
Do you want me to say more?
Well, I think we're about to spend half an hour or so saying more, so
okay.
Let's explore that and come back and see if you feel the same at the end of it and why others may or may not disagree.
Sure.
So look, let's start in the 1960s, and I'm going to put it to you here, Rob. Is the 1960s the most violent era of the show?
Well, I think the Hartnell Doctor likes to get into a blue from time to time. And there's the suggestion in multiple stories that if he has to knock someone out or maybe even kill them, he will. But I don't think the 60s owns violence, Dave. I mean, sure, in the War Games, we have one of Pat's execution squad getting shot and he drops to the ground. You know, this scene holding his chest and there's blood oozing through. And blood is something you rarely see in Doctor Who. But when we get to the 70s, and we'll talk about the 70s later, this is done bigger and better there. So I'm not sure the 60s owns violence, but there are some violent moments in it.
Yeah, the Doctor, I think, is definitely a lot more violent and indeed ruthless in the 60s. There are the notorious Hartnell examples, him braining somebody with a spade in Reign of Terror, him being willing to, kill a caveman and an unearthly child. He takes great delight in fisticuffs in the Romans. But also, you see the Troughton Doctor. He's the one that's willing to sort of wipe out entire armies when it suits him. He's the one that's willing to go around zapping ice warriors with a great big light gun. But the other thing is, where they do violence here, it feels quite real. So something like the Aztecs, when Ian's fighting for his life with Ixtar, it feels like a proper fight, and as though there's stakes involved. I think people get killed in a much nastier sort of way. There is a level of sexual violence in the Hartnell era particularly that I don't think you see anywhere else in the show. I mean, we basically have not quite on-screen rapes, but close to in the Hartnell era. And we talked about that when we did our episode on the Time Meddler.
Well, Perry might disagree.
Well, Perry's an interesting case, where we can talk about it. You've got Vasor and the not even implied intent of what he wants to do to Barbara. So I think it's not quite as big and brash as other eras, but there's a real edge and realism to the violence in this era, and particularly that performed by the Doctor. That, I'm not saying that I'm just going to put a flag in the ground here and say this is the most violent era, full stop, end of conversation. But I wanted to open with that question because I think for an era that a lot of people don't watch a lot and probably wouldn't think of it as being like that, there is a lot of it.
Yeah, and look, as an aside, I did come across an article. I was doing some research for today's episode. I came across an article by Mike Kenwood in Celestial Toy Room issue 484-485. And in that, he puts together the kill count for each Doctor. And both Bill and Pat are very high on the kill count. They're not at the top, but they're very high, thanks largely to their Dalek stories like Master Plan and Evil, where they're bumping off Daleks in their thousands. And I think this is what you might have been referring to earlier. They have no qualms about bumping off whole armies. So, based on the numbers, the black and white era is certainly suggestive of a lot of killing, which goes hand in hand with violence, really.
Yeah, and you look in the Troughton era at a story like, for example, Tomb of the Cybermen, you get somebody very nastily electrocuted, you get somebody shot with a cyber gun and they writhe and smoke comes out of their body, you get you get the Cyberman who's attacked and the foam machine oozes out, and that was talked about in the press at the time.
Do you think it's because it's black and white that people don't notice it as much? Like, when you're watching something in, say, the Davo era or the Colin era, and Green Gunge comes out of a Cyberman, you can go, oh, wow, that's really gross. But when you have that scene in the War Games where the guy on the execution squad gets shot himself, and the blood is oozing out, but because it's in black and white, it's just like a darker colour on a dark tunic. And if you're maybe not paying attention, you don't see it, but it is there.
I think that that's a big part of it, absolutely. I think it's also that in our minds, black and white says old.
Yeah,
it says back then, and so it feels maybe a bit more distant and a bit safer for us now watching it, whereas, the 80s just feels like our childhood, whereas the 60s, like, that's another era. Yeah. And I do wonder whether that's why it was allowed to get away with it. Were people just not really paying attention to what was happening on television at that stage, where things that you could do on the stage just transitioned happily to television, and Mary Whitehouse and various lobby groups just hadn't quite got their act together at the time.
Yeah, well, you think of the kids of that era and what they'd be playing out in the playground. They'd be playing with guns. They'd be tying each other up. They'd be doing all sorts of awful things, and the parents were probably like, "That's fine." So maybe the TV was reflective of that.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I think that we'll come back to the question: is it the most violent era? But it's a lot more violent than people remember.
For sure, absolutely.
We then get into the Pertwee era, Rob.
Mm.
Now, there's a lot of action in the Pertwee era. Is it really violence, or is it TV violence?
Well, define what you mean by TV violence, Dave.
So TV violence to me is when it's very obviously people acting. So, for example, unit soldiers run into the castle in The Mind of Evil, and there's a lot of people shooting a lot of guns, but nobody really screams. There's certainly no blood. Everyone just sort of, like the playground, grabs their chest and goes, and falls over.
Yeah,
The brigadier, bang, 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 people fall down. It's playground violence, isn't it?
Well, yes. Yes, to answer your question. I mean, on the topic of unit, I'd say although it's mostly hammy sort of stunt work that doesn't have you covering your eyes and thinking, oh my God, that's just terrible, it's still representative of violence. Blokes firing rifles, submachine guns, pistols all over the shop. The brigadier solves problems with force. That's all violence. When the Silurians get blown up, that's violence. But it does have the message that, well, that's not the way to do things, folks. So it's certainly a different kind of violence to the 60s.
Yeah, and certainly compared to what's to come. That said, I think we've perhaps both got some examples of where the Pertwee era does get a little bit nasty. The chair in The Terror of the Autons is surely a famous example.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that's, I think, made worse because this isn't somebody just falling over quietly and moving themselves off set. The actor who's playing it spends a couple of minutes suffering.
Mm.
There's really time to go, this is scary and this is happening slowly. And I think that's where the Pertwee era does get a little bit gritty when it takes its time. I think the Plague in the Silurians is another example where it sort of takes time and it's slow and it's creepy. And also another example I just want to put out there is the Green Death. Not because I think that, giant papier-mâché maggots in green slime is itself necessarily all that much more scary than anything else. But because the way that the story's written allows enough time for the characters to be scared and for the characters to be sad. And that scene where Joe talks to Cliff about Bert the miner dying, and, he basically risked himself to save her, and Cliff gives her that speech about he's the only one that'll ever be. It's right to grieve. Your grief is natural. Your grief is special. That's something that Who doesn't do a lot. But I know as a kid watching that, suddenly it hits you in a way that the Brigadier going, bang, bang, you're dead doesn't, because it's fast-paced and you move on and you don't really notice as a kid. But when people talk about, well, he's dead and he's gone and it's sad, that as a kid you go, oh, hang on, this is sad.
Yeah, that's almost an RTD kind of take, but we'll get to him in a moment,
We
I guess.
will absolutely get to him, yes.
If I return to that article by Mike Kenwood, and I promise I won't keep doing this, but I did note down that the Third Doctor, according to Mike Kenwood, notches up 3,513 kills in his era, or an average of 146 deaths per televised story. This number, though, is helped greatly by the assumption that at least 3,000 Sea Devils are bumped off in the Sea Devils. Of course, he's not really bumping off 146 people per show. You know, the numbers can lie in that respect. But certainly the Pertwee era is no stranger to violence. And again, the Sea Devils, a few thousand die in that.
Yeah, and do you think the Pertwee era, and the Third Doctor particularly, get away with it a bit more because there is a lot more lecturing about non-violent solutions? As you pointed out, Rob, although we have the Brigadier going around shooting everybody, you also have the Doctor going, Brigadier, that's not the solution.
Yeah.
Do you think that softens the blow effectively?
I think it does. I think it almost shows the audience that it was in there in order to have the message, you know, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think it does. I think it's an interesting balance, and I think reflective of television at the time as well.
Definitely.
Do you want to kick us off with what comes next, Rob?
Well, it's the Tom Baker era, Dave.
It is.
And now we get to the second part of what I was talking about earlier. While the War Games has that bloke getting shot and the blood drips through his fingers, the Tom Baker era has a story like The Brain of Morbius, where you have Solon shooting Kondo. And while there's maybe a little less blood than in the War Games, the way Kondo's shirt is ripped open and some blood actually shoots out, and it's in colour, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, colour in black and white. I think it makes it worse than what we saw in the War Games. It's quite extraordinary, especially when people talk about Colin's era, and we'll get to Colin's era in a minute. This is just as bad, and no one says a thing about it, relatively speaking. And I'll comment more on that when we get to Colin. But yes, look, the Tom Baker era, there's just one story I've pulled out. There is some colossal violence in the Tom Baker era.
Yeah, I can remember being a kid watching The Talons of Weng Chiang for the first time. And that scene where you see the Peking homunculus, and there's a close-up of the hand, and you just see the blood just dripping down the hand. As a kid, that was a moment of, what? Oh, yeah. This is a bit nasty. That's blood. That's proper blood. Ooh, okay, I'm not sure I'm quite comfortable here. So I think you're absolutely right. There is a lot more violence and there is a lot more blood, and that's what contrasts it with the Pertwee era. But I think where the Hinchcliffe era is most memorably violent and nasty is that body horror and that suffering. I think you think about Namin being killed at the end of Pyramids of Mars Part 1 as they bring Sutek's gift of death to all humanity. And he's just screaming as steam's rising from him, and he screams more steam, and he's burning, and there's the sound of sizzling flesh. You know, that's pretty full on. You get the scene that was cut from the Ark in Space. Philip Hinchcliffe's first proper story, you know, as a producer. And he's already having to cut a scene, not because Noah looks too horrible. He's happy to show Noah, you know, turning into a Wirrn and, you know, covered in alien stuff. He's happy to show that, but Noah saying, Vira, kill me, please kill me, was the bridge too far.
Yeah, I can live with the bubble wrap, but the the dialogue is, the dialogue sells it. Yeah,
and that brings me neatly to the moment in Doctor Who that most scared and upset me as a kid, and it's this and then Daylight Underneath, and that's the Seeds of Doom, the scene where Keeler is turning into the Krynoid and he's begging to be released, and he starts to do the whole "you want me to die," and you're just seeing this guy who is helpless as his body is taken away. He's basically dying in slow motion. And that's really, really violent, really, really nasty. And that's, I think, where the show perhaps did go a little bit too far. But again, Hinchcliffe cut the end of that scene because the scene goes on where the butler brings him in the raw meat that Mr. Chase wants him to eat, so to build him up nice and big and strong. He's like, no. The scene cuts there, but originally, as filmed, eventually Keeler gives in to his crude instincts and starts eating the raw flesh.
Oh, wow.
Now, Hinchcliffe had the common sense to cut that.
Shades of Delta and the Bannermen there.
Yes, except it's, done for real.
Yeah. I was going to say, when I was, again, boning up on this topic for this podcast, Seeds of Doom also has the scene where I think half of fandom think the Doctor breaks a guy's neck, but he doesn't.
No, he just sort of gives him a bit of a stage flick or something, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. He manipulates the guy's neck, but it's to knock him out. But I swear, half the articles I came across said, violence in Doctor Who, the Tom Baker Doctor breaks a guy's neck. No, he doesn't.
No, he doesn't, but I suspect a lot of those were written back in the time when you couldn't pull out the VHS and watch it.
Yeah, that's true as well.
So people were going on the memories. And look, Tom's very careful about the way that the Doctor does violence in this era. A lot happens around him, but take the Seeds of Doom, which, look, it's a wonderful story. It's my favourite Tom Baker story. I love it. But it's incredibly violent. I mean, you've got the mincing machine there, and I'm not talking about Harrison Chase. But you got that. Thank you.
I did get that.
But, when the Doctor does go to punch the chauffeur, Tom plays it very carefully. He does play it as a moment of hesitation. You can sort of see him pulling his punch a bit before he does do it. And then when he carries the gun around, Sarah says, "You'll never use it," but they don't know that. So, there is that sort of reinforcement going on there. Tom, that said, did love to have his cake and eat it too, and sometimes I think was just being temperamental. Famously, the cliffhanger to part 1 of Stones of Blood had to be reworked because Tom refused to push Romana over the cliff, even though it wasn't the real Doctor. It was the image of the Doctor that Cessair was projecting. He said, no, I can't be seen to be violent to the companion. That would upset the kids at home. One story later, for the cliffhanger of part 2 of Androids of Tara, he's happy to smash someone who looks like Romana over the head with a scepter. So, not consistent. But certainly I think Tom was aware that the Doctor couldn't necessarily be all that violent, which brings us neatly to the Deadly Assassin.
Oh, yes, please.
Take it away, Rob.
Well, what can we say, Dave? I mean, this is the one that sent Mary Whitehouse right over the edge with the violence in this one.
It's probably the story that got Philip Hinchcliffe moved on, and it's probably the story that had some of the most genuine ramifications for the show's direction compared to almost any other. This was the one where the BBC had perhaps been warning Hinchcliffe for a while, borderline Phil, and then it's like, no, you've crossed the line. I mentioned the Stones of Blood there, a fairly light-hearted story for the most part. You've got funny lawyer creatures and Amelia Rumford and K9, and then you have 2 campers brutally slaughtered as the screen fades to blood red.
Yeah.
And again, as a kid, that was wow.
Yeah, when we rewatched that for some reason recently, Dave. Did we do the season overview, or we did something where we had to watch that?
Yes.
And I was reminded of that just in the past, year or so. It's extraordinary, that moment.
It was. So, the 70s, a lot nastier, a lot grittier. TV, though, was becoming like that. You got a lot of those hard-boiled detective shows. You got a lot of horror, and, cinema was definitely doing it. So I get the influence, but I think the Fourth Doctor mostly was careful about how he took part.
Yes, that's fair.
And I think it is when he gets personally involved in something like Deadly Assassin that people see lines crossed.
And then we move into the Saward era, Dave.
But it's interesting that on the running sheet here, and in your comment just then, we don't call this the Davo era or the Colin era or the JNT era. We call it the Saward era. Because, let's be honest, a lot of the violence in that era of the show is defined by Saward. Partly, I think, because he believed that a certain amount of 80s style action adventure was exciting, and it's what the audience wanted, and it's what he wanted to write about. I think that's pretty clear. But he's got on record a number of times and said his view is, if you're going to show violence, don't shrink from the consequences. If you're going to show somebody being shot, show that it's nasty, show that it hurts, show that it kills somebody. If you're going to show somebody being tortured, show that it's nasty, so that kids learn and appreciate that that's the consequence of violence, and therefore it shouldn't be mimicked. Now, I don't know psychologically whether he's right or wrong, but that was his philosophy.
Yeah, and look, that's a close bedfellow to, if you're going to kill someone in a story, make sure they stay dead.
Yeah.
Which is something I believe in.
Yeah,
because
we
death
discussed
is
often, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very big, serious, final thing. And if someone is killed, you don't do it for a cheap trick. You do it to have some real meaning. But yes, both Davo and Colin get stories script edited by Saward. And I think Davo probably gets the best deal out of the Saward era. And whether that's just because Saward gets more and more out of control as time goes on, and he keeps pushing the boat out so that by the time we get to Colin, the violence is just worse, or whether Saward was being pulled along by the times, and even if he doesn't think so, he was reacting to the times, who can say? Maybe a combination of those things. But Davo's stories, I think, feel like Doctor Who adventures on the whole, whereas the moments of violence we remember from Colin, the acid bath, Lytton's crushed hands, the cyanide stuff in Two Doctors, Davros's hand getting shot off in Revelation, that's all from Colin's era. So, I mean, while there are some bits of violence in Davo's eras, there are some gross out things, you know, the vomiting Cyberman and Five Doctors, things like this. I think Colin gets the worst of it.
Yeah, I think an important distinction here is that in the Davison era, the Doctor is less involved in those moments, whereas in the Colin era, he's all over them. You think about something like Earthshock, which is, of course, Saward's big breakout story. He'd written Visitation before, but Earthshock's the one where he, really arrived as a Doctor Who presence. And stuff like the death of Schneider in that, where she's just gooified, and then you have her colleagues, looking for her, walking over this just sort of, gooified body with a little name tag on top of it. That's a violent moment, that's a nasty moment, but the Doctor's a long way away. Caves of Androzani, yes, the Doctor gets beaten up a bit, but most of the real violence in that is, the character of Stotts, for example, and the Doctor's nowhere nearby. The bit where Stotts has got Krelper, dangling over a cliff, forcing him to take a cyanide pill, the Doctor's not involved.
Yeah.
Whereas the examples you gave about the Colin era, not only is the Doctor there, the Doctor is generally perpetrating them.
Yeah, well, I missed out Colin blowing away Cybermen with a cyber weapon.
Yeah, and look, that I'm less worried about. And I think that if we're going to give Troughton a pass for wasting Ice Warriors, you kind of have to give Colin a pass for wasting Cybermen. And I think, again, a distinction can be made between violence to people and violence to monsters. Nobody ever complains about the Doctor wasting the Borad, because the Borad's clearly a monster. I don't think people really care that much about the Doctor wasting the Cyber Controller, because Cybermen are monsters. And the interesting one that blurs that line is Shockeye. Shockeye is not a human. Shockeye is an androgum, and androgums are the monster of the story. They're big, scary things that are really strong and have inhuman strength and inhuman characteristics, and it's just that the makeup isn't quite as big. They're not in a rubber suit. So we kind of don't think of them as a monster, even though the story treats them as such. So suddenly the Doctor killing him is bad because he looks like a human.
Yeah, good point. Dave, I'll throw something up here. I think it's fair that Colin's era gets defined by violence. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that is definitely a way that people define his era.
Okay. But I'll stick in the thought here that if Colin had a longer era, maybe it would have balanced out a bit more. For example, back in the Tom era, we spoke about, Solon shooting Kondo in Morbius. And indeed, in that same story, the Doctor kills Solon with cyanide gas. This is all pretty horrible stuff, but we don't define Tom's era by that. Similarly, if Colin had a bunch of seasons, and the things that happened mostly in season 22 didn't happen in season 23, 24, 25, if he was making those seasons, would the result have been different?
Yeah, I think it would, and I think that it actually would have happened. You look at Trial of a Time Lord, and there's definitely a tone down of violence there. The Mysterious Planet has a couple of icky moments, like the death of Katrika and Broken Tooth is a kind of a nasty moment, but it's also kind of, it's that adventure moment. It's what you expect from action television in the 80s. But a lot of the nastiness isn't quite there. Mind Warp is the big exception. That's very nasty and very violent, and what it does to Perry, you're right, is horrible. Terror of the Vervoids, it's halfway between the two. Mm-hmm. I definitely remember as a kid, aged about 6 or 7, the Vervoid Thorns were quite a nasty and scary thing.
Yeah.
But by the time you get to the ultimate foe, it's all comic book violence. You can throw big harpoons at people and then laugh about it.
Yeah, very different.
So it was going down a path, but I don't know whether I agree with Saward, but I give him credit for actually having a philosophy and having a rationale for it. Right or wrong, he said, no, this is what I'm doing and why. And, okay. Who's to say he's more right or wrong than others?
Yeah, well, look, I've said many times on the show, it's a big, dangerous galaxy out there, and you can't treat it all the time like a farce or a romp or, some sort of camp runaround. People do die, horrible things do happen. You have to show that sometimes, but you don't want the show to be that every week either.
Correct. I think that's right. And that's a nice segue into the McCoy era. And another question for you, Rob. Mm-hmm. Is the McCoy era the one that gets the balance most right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so too.
And I'll tell you why. I think it gets it right for a kid's show, in quotation marks. You have the Kangs in Paradise Towers, but they're the nicest, cleanest street urchins you could ever hope to meet. They're not like something out of Mad Max. They're like something out of a senior high school production of something,
Yeah.
Some musical. You can smell the shampoo and the Impulse body spray on them, Dave.
Yeah.
They're not about to cut someone's throat and give them a Columbia necktie or something, or the Bannermen, we mentioned them earlier. There's a lot of posturing and eating pretend lumps of meat, but they're a bit more panto villain than anything else. And although these examples bring their own issues and a bit of eye-rolling, I think it suits Sylvester's era and is more keeping with Doctor Who was meant to be at that time. So, yeah, I think Sylvester does get the balance right.
Yeah, I think the Haemovores are a wonderful monster and they're scary, but they don't really do a lot of violent things. There's a lot of stalking and a lot of sort of looming over victims, but you don't see them being particularly vicious.
No.
Battlefield, there's a lot of people getting shot and a lot of explosions, but you don't really see blood and guts. Although you do have that moment after the battle where Bambera looks at the face of the young Knight Commander. There is that just moment of, look, this was all fun and games and everything, but, people died and this isn't a good thing.
Yeah, and look, it's funny because Unit is in that story as well, but we're back in the Pertwee Unit days, with people, running around and doing ridiculous flips and, all of this sort of stuff. It's not campy, but it's not entirely realistic, I'll say that much.
No, and finally you get to Survival, which is perhaps the most violent story in the McCoy era. But even then, they're very careful about what they actually show. There's a lot of cutting away just before the knife goes in, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And at this point, insert the obligatory reference that in Australia, this coincided with Doctor Who being shown at a child-friendly time slot. It was no longer a nighttime thing.
No, it was on at 5:30 in the afternoon as part of kids' magazine programming.
And it fit. It fit perfect.
And it did, because again, it is that balance of adventure and action and excitement and some implied violence without being nasty.
Yes.
So look, we've gone through the classic era in a lot of detail because I think there's a lot to say about the classic era.
And we've also watched it a million times.
And we've also watched it a million times. Yes, that's true. We get to 2005, and fair to say that the TV landscape has changed considerably by now.
Yes.
It's funny, I've made the comment before, and I remember we had this conversation a little bit when we did our episode on Queer Doctor Who and talking about LGBT sexuality in Doctor Who a few years ago now, that with the exception of a few stories in the Hartnell era, the classic series basically shies away from depicting sexuality as much as possible. There might be an occasional peck on the lips, a little bit of sort of, love at first sight across the dance floor sort of thing, but it didn't really do sexuality. It did violence a lot.
Yeah.
Whereas New Who is happy to have everybody shag everybody.
Yeah.
That's not a problem. You can shag everybody. You get gay characters, you get lesbian characters, you get, companions just, off for a one-night stand. But violence, it's actually very rare. And one thing that brought it home to me was when I watched The Stolen Earth again a little while ago, and there's a scene there where the Daleks kill a family, including children. It's not done quite on screen, but you have a family that goes inside. They said, "Stuff you Daleks, we're going inside," and the Daleks blow up the house. So it's pretty clear that family was killed. And I thought, wow, that's really, really out there. And it stood out, and it wasn't particularly violent, but it stood out because of just how straight a lot of the series is. Likewise, some of those scenes in Family of Blood, where you've got the scarecrows walking towards the machine guns and the kids crying and everybody's suddenly like, oh my god, this is what war's really like, oh my god. That stands out in an era that's normally very, very cautious.
Yeah, I was giving this some thought. Could it be as simple as the difference between European and American content? American content's always famous for showing violence, but, Jesus Christ, don't show a topless woman, whatever you do. Whereas European content might be more the reverse. I know growing up on a diet of foreign film on SBS back in the 1990s, it always seemed European cinema had naked people all through it and not as much violence at all. And, of course, these are generalizations. With the move to cable and streaming, we now have shows from both sides of the Atlantic, totally flip the board on this stuff, and you do get American shows with lots of TNA and stuff. But it does leave me wondering whether there's just this British inclination maybe to more titillation and less violence.
Yeah, maybe. But I think it's also generational as well.
Yeah.
I think that let's face it, without wanting to go too far down this rabbit hole, we mentioned earlier about Bottom Gun, and we grew up watching a cartoon about a robot that had a machine gun in its ass and went around with great big violent battles, and people would die horrible deaths and all that sort of thing, stuff like Battle of the Planets. You had Monkey, which had some pretty cool violence every episode. That's a long way from the very wholesome, educational and well thought out and researched television that kids get today. I think a lot of parents would never let the kid, as a 6-year-old or a 4-year-old, watch Astro Boy as we did.
Really?
They're not shown. They're not shown. That morning we're getting ready for work, put the kids in front of the TV. It's not Astro Boy anymore. It's Peppa Pig.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, because I don't have kids, so this isn't really top of mind stuff for me. But I know of things like Peppa Pig, and I know of things like Bluey. I don't watch them, but I know of them. And yes, they are quite different to Astro Boy shooting bullets out of his ass, aren't they, Dave?
They are, and we've actually got a couple of letters on that topic, so it'll be interesting to come to that. Breaking down the new series by era, I've got a couple of generalisations to put to you.
Mm-hmm.
RTD loves the emotion of one very personal death. Chibnall loves a massacre.
Yeah. Well, we did have the Chibnall death count when we used to do hot takes.
We did have the Chibnall death count. He loves to have a high body count. He loves to wipe out half the universe, in fact. Regularly that's a thing the Chibnall era. There's a lot of things blowing up, a lot of things being killed. And again, in the numbers, it sort of softens it a bit. That old thing about one death's a tragedy, 1 million deaths is a news story sort of thing.
Yeah, statistic.
A statistic, yeah, that's it. So I think that Chibnall leads into that, whereas RTD isn't a particularly violent era. It's very family friendly. It's a lot more sexual than Doctor used to be. But occasionally he knows just to throw it in, and sometimes he really leans into it. Midnight, I think, is a really good example where there's a lot of sort of not violence in terms of people beating each other up or people, with blood everywhere, but just some scary things happening. And then that moment after it's all happened of the Doctor saying, does anybody know her name? And just reflecting on the fact that a real person has died here and that we need to be very, very aware of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the attitudes to violence are similar to the writing styles of the three different showrunners overall. I mean, RTD is the character-driven writer guy. If he writes a death, wow, you're going to feel it. Moffat I think I'm the cleverest writer in the room, and, well, he probably is, but,
yeah.
he doesn't have to say
To be fair, yeah.
Who'll write a death, and it might work or it might not. It might be genius, it might be pure cheese, it could be any of these things. And then Chibnall, who always felt like he was hanging on for dear life and, sending the production team first drafts to work with. And his approach is just very big, very Marvel movies. Just throw everything in, something will stick. Here's the script. I've got to write the next one. As a result, I think Moffat's era is probably the most balanced of the three. He can hit you in the feels at times, but at the same time, one of his doctors, in the form of Smith, scores incredibly high on that killing list I mentioned earlier, thanks to a number of his stories. He helped take out a planet of Cybermen, for example, or tons of Silents get killed when they're revealed on Earth, and so on and so forth. So Moffat is probably the midpoint, and ironically, he's the midpoint of the three showrunners so far. But they all are different. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and an interesting thing with Moffat is that when he did kill a companion, even though he undid it a couple of episodes later, but when he did kill Clara, Capaldi went on TV sort of a couple of nights before and did obviously a very prepared semi-scripted interview where he said, yes, now this is going to be a sad episode of Doctor Who because, yes, this is the one where Clara's going to die. And it was almost like saying to the audience, we know we can't just kill a companion without giving you warning. We need you all to be very aware of this and very ready and parents be ready to have the talk. It felt as though they had to manage that, which is a huge contrast to we don't want anyone to know Adric dies because we want everybody at the end of that episode to go, oh, shit, what just happened?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very different. But Dave, in the modern era, I had a good think across all the stories, and I struggled at times to think of some really purely violent stuff. There is violent stuff. Clara getting killed, for example, is violent. But stuff like people's faces turning into gas masks in The Empty Child, or Satan showing up in the Satan Pit, or the conversion of people into ice warriors that aren't ice warriors in The Waters of Mars, or the cyber conversion in World Enough and Time. This is scary stuff. This is body horror stuff. I'm not sure it's quite violence per se. When we have things like big space battles, that's quite violent, but it's on a massive scale that's not personal. So, as I thought through it, I thought, is the modern era actually that violent if you sort of narrow down violence to being a very particular thing?
Yeah, which I think brings us neatly back to where we started this conversation.
Oh, good.
Where my
that wasn't deliberate.
No, you did that very naturally and very perfectly. So well done.
Well, thank you.
Points to what house are you in?
Ravenclaw.
Oh, me too. Points to Ravenclaw.
Very good.
Look, my answer to the question, is Doctor Who a violent show, is, I think, on balance the same as yours. No. It's an adventure show. It's sometimes a scary show. But for the most part, it isn't a blood and guts, beating people up, violent show. And I think that is why when it does arc that up, people notice. When the Hinchcliffe era goes that way, people notice. When the Doctor's beating up people in the Reign of Terror, people notice. When Colin's throwing people in acid baths, yes, I know he doesn't throw them in there, it's an accident, but you know what I'm saying. Like, people do notice. These are aberrations. And as you said, Rob, I think it's good that we have these aberrations. I think it's good we sometimes push the boundaries and do different things. But is Doctor Who consistently, as part of its raison d'etre, a violent show? I think you're right. I think the answer's no.
Yeah, and at the start I said I'd elaborate more, and that's basically it for me. When you look at the width and the breadth of Doctor Who, violence isn't happening all the time. And there's far more that's not violent. So, no, on balance, it's not a violent show. That's where I was going with that initial thought.
So, Rob, look, before we go any further with our conclusion, we've had 2 emails about this topic, and coming from, as you flagged earlier, some perspectives that perhaps we don't have. And I'll read the first, you read the second, then let's have a bit of a quick conversation about what they've added to the topic.
Sure.
So the first is from our friend Mark at 42 to Doomsday.
Hello, Mark.
He says, Dear Rob and Dave, Since its inception, Doctor Who has, on a number of occasions, particularly during its original run, been deemed to be too violent. Viewers were often quoted as saying, "I used to watch it behind the sofa because it was scary or frightening," but I can't remember hearing, "I used to watch it behind the sofa because of the violent acts perpetrated towards or by the Doctor and his companions." Growing up in the late 70s, I remember as an 8 and 9-year-old watching TV shows such as The Professionals with my parents. Bodie and Doyle would regularly beat the crap out of other people. Did this make me go out on a rampage in my local village punching up all and sundry? Not really. Did they stop me watching it? No, they didn't. My parents had no objection to me watching Doctor Who and never questioned what was being shown on screen. On most occasions, it was the Australian government or the ABC who deemed it was too violent for myself and many viewers. Doctor Who was screened at 6:30pm, which was roughly the same time slot as the UK. I grew up in the 80s where I was exposed to the era of the video nasty and violent and high body count action blockbusters. The violence in these films seemed more real. Maybe it was the practical effects or the situation seemed more believable than the action movies of today where CGI extravaganzas and rapid intercuts make it look so glossy that it dulls the violence and often cartoonish, which reduces its plausibility. My then 12-year-old wanted to watch the original RoboCop movie. I accidentally showed the unrated version, Bad Dad, and I could see his reaction to the more violent and traumatic bits of the movie.
Yeah.
I asked him if he wanted me to turn it off, and he insisted to keep watching it, but I gave him that choice. My children were never particularly interested in Doctor Who. Poor fathering there, Mark.
Yeah, terrible.
But on the rare occasions, I would put on some of the safer choices, such as Revenge of the Cybermen, Death to the Daleks, and steered away from stories such as Seeds of Doom or Caves of Androzani. But this was mainly from a body horror shock perspective, and we never delved into New Who primarily due to my violent reaction towards it, which I didn't want my kids to see. However, when we do watch some classic Doctor Who or 80s movies such as Predator or Rambo, First Blood, I'm shocked at some of the violence and think to myself, how did I ever watch this when I was their age? My view is it's up to the parents to deem what is suitable for their kids to watch. They know them best, but sit down and watch it with them and gauge their reaction and check in with them, and if all else fails, press the off button. Speaking of violence, keep punching. All the best, Mark from 42 to Doomsday.
Oh, very good. And my response to that is when the first 6 Doctors were out there killing or having violent things happen in their shows, out in the garden, I hinted at this earlier, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, kids were out there playing with toy guns, shooting each other. But as the 80s went along, that stuff did start to become frowned on. I had cousins who weren't allowed to play with, quotation marks, war toys, Dave. And of course, when they'd come to my place, they'd be grabbing the replica M16 water pistol, the grenade launcher, the sawn-off shotgun that I had, you know, and running around with me like maniacs. They loved it. They bloody loved it. But the point is, the attitudes of parents saying no to war toys or whatever their stance might be was absolutely a thing that was coming into vogue in the late 80s. Maybe it played into Sylvester's era in some ways, you know, along with other thoughts like don't hit your children and all of that sort of stuff. You know, a number of topics related to violence that, you know, you did have people saying back in the 60s or 70s, but they were few and far between. By the late 80s and into the 90s, such people were being taken more seriously, and it was becoming a much more common thing that, no, I'm not going to give my kids guns. No, I'm not going to smack my kid. All of that sort of stuff was going on in society. Yeah,
and I think the show reflects that. Rob, you've got a second email on the topic.
I do, Dave. This one is from your co-host on the Spacefall, a Blake 7 podcast, Richard, and he says, "Hi, Rob and Dave. Very interested in your topic for this month and got me thinking about my experiences now I'm a dad. My son saw the series fairly early. He was around 5 to 6 when I started back on the Doctor Who Club of Victoria committee for the 2 to 3 years leading into the 50th anniversary. And because I was watching a lot more Doctor Who at the time, he was definitely exposed to it. I probably first saw Who around the same age, but didn't really become a devoted fan until a year or two later when the show moved into the regular weeknight slot. I did make a point of showing him a few stories so he could see the different Doctors, etc. But I do remember selecting some of the more innocuous ones so he could both follow them and wasn't thrust straight into Caves of Androzani or Seeds of Doom. Did Richard and Mark collaborate on these letters? That's a scarily similar thought to Mark's.
It is, yes.
We went through stuff like Time Warrior for Pertwee, Robot for Tom, The Five Doctors, and the first Dalek movie. So death and some violence, but not Hinchcliffe/Sayward levels. We did watch some harder stories later. I don't think the violence or anything else ever bothered him. He went through Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and superhero phases around the same time. More that Who's just something he never really got into, even the newer, flashier and faster series. My daughter had zero interest in Who from day one, so there was really no dilemma there. Thinking back, I guess the choice of not showing him what I knew were probably nastier stories was maybe parental overprotectiveness, although being more aware of kids' programming since having my own family, the times and attitudes have changed. It's probably a function of the increased focus on media for kids and the emergence of dedicated channels and more recently streaming, as opposed to just parking children in front of Looney Tunes and repeats of old US sitcoms that were served up as a lot of the kids' programming in the 1970s, or the glorified toy commercials of the 1980s. In the old days, families likely had one or at most two TVs, so as kids you either had to sit in front of whatever was on one of the 4 channels regardless of content, or go and do something completely unrelated. So we're probably exposed far earlier to more adult viewing and content, even if it was seeing repeats of war movies or John Wayne or Clint Eastwood taking care of bad guys in the Saturday night westerns, but arguably saw more news and current affairs programming because of this. I don't remember Doctor Who ever really scaring or upsetting me as a kid, but I can remember my parents sending me out of the room a couple of times when whatever they were watching got a bit spicy, although I think this was more for sex than violence. Now, my kids can immerse themselves in Disney, Netflix, or even the Nickelodeon channel non-stop, while even taking the iPad into the toilet and without seeing a single frame of the news. The saturation of TV and media in general these days makes for far more disposable and ephemeral content, so a lot of series, not just kids shows, just seem to drop off the radar after a few years as they become dated, less relevant, or present now undesirable attitudes. Star Wars upped to the ante on visual effects, and there's really been a lot of pressure on genre TV and media to keep up since. My son even now comments that the older Marvel movies look dated. Looking forward to the chat from Richard.
Thanks to Richard and Mark for sending those in. And I think it's interesting that they've both raised the point that as parents now, they're very, very cautious about letting their kids watch episodes of Doctor Who that would just put on at 6:30 and in some cases 5:30 in the afternoon, and we would have been allowed to watch at that age without anybody blinking.
Yeah. And as I say, I don't have kids, so, I sit here and think, oh, what are you talking about? I'd show it to them, but maybe once I had a kid and saw the child being born and saw them going through their first birthday, their second birthday, their third birthday, my attitudes would be completely different to what I let them watch. But as a single man, I'm like, yeah, just showcase Vandrozani, it's fine.
Yeah, you can show an 8-year-old Jurassic Park, sure, why not?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so look, I think that does confirm our contention that attitudes in society towards television violence did change a lot over the 60 years of the show, and the show has reflected that.
Absolutely.
So look, we've had a wide-ranging discussion on the topic of violence in Doctor Who, a bit of audience feedback already. If you've got thoughts on this, we would love to hear them. Rob and I do not pretend we're the experts on this topic at all. We're just sort of, chewing the fat as we normally do, and if you think we're wrong, right, or something in between, let us know.
Yeah, we're just these guys,
Just these guys,